Thank you for tuning in today's workshop on the prospect of pumped storage in Asia at the Asia Clean Energy Forum 2021. The meeting will begin very soon in a few minutes, so please wait while we wait for other participants to join. Thank you. Welcome to today's workshop on the prospect of pumped storage hydropower in Asia. With sincere thanks to ADB and the ACEF Secretariat, we are very pleased to be here with you to share some of the latest findings from the International Forum on Pumped Storage Hydropower and meet with experts in the region to share insights on pumped storage development. So I'm Samuel Law, the host of today's workshop, and the IHA International Hydropower Association is the secretariat for the International Forum on Pumped Storage Hydropower. In today's meeting, we will first begin by introducing the forum and also followed by presentation from our guest speakers. They are from ANU with the Global Atlas on Pumped Storage Hydro, and also experience from China, Tasmania, and Sri Lanka. Finally, we will hear insights from the APEC countries. We will then be followed by 20 minutes of questions and answer session towards the end of the workshop, so please feel free to submit your questions via the chat at any time of the meeting. There are a few housekeeping items that I'd like you to be aware of. Due to the large number of participants, you are muted on entry, but please feel free to submit your questions during the chat. And also, please look which organization you are from. We'll try to address all your questions during the discussion period. And also, this meeting will be recorded. So we will provide the recording available on our forum website. You may also find the agenda and the briefing document on the emerging findings of the forum under the Handout tab on the control panel, indicated in the image on the right. You're also welcome to use hashtag Pump Storage Forum and also hashtag ACEF 2021 to post about the event on social media. So let's begin by introducing what is pump storage. Pump storage, also known as the world's water battery, is a try and test energy storage technology that has been operating for almost 100 years. It's currently accounting for over 90% of the world's installed capacity in energy storage in grid-scale energy storage applications. There are over 40 countries with pump storage operations, but China, Japan, and the United States are home to over 50% of the world's total installed capacity. You may ask why there's a resurgence of interest in pump storage. It's because in the search of long-duration energy storage, there has been seen as a holy grail of solving the intermittency problem of solar and wind. And pump storage offers a very cost-effective way to provide the large-scale balancing and essential grid services to ensure power system stability while we have a higher level of variable availability in the system. As you may see on the plot, the majority of existing pump storage stations have a capacity over 500 megawatts and its discharge duration between 6 to 24 hours, with some stations even capable of seasonal storage. And you may see, comparing to battery storage, they are usually in the range of less than 4 hours of discharge duration and also less than 500 megawatts. This could be further illustrated with a simple cost comparison. Based on the latest US DOE Energy Storage Cost Assessment Report, we compare a table on 100 megawatt 4-hour storage energy storage systems. As you can see in the table, pump storage and chemical batteries, they are all capable of providing inertia, reactive power control, and black start. However, when we look into the capex for power and energy, you can see that for a 4-hour discharge duration system, pump storage has a higher capex than lithium-ion battery on paper. But if you take into account of the long lifetime of pump storage, which is from the industry experience, can be over 80 years, and applied with a 6% discount rate, you will see that the effective capex of pump storage is almost half of that of battery storage in 80 years, as batteries will need to be replaced every 10 years. So if pump storage can offer so much to the energy transition, what is the challenges facing pump storage? So now we can see that there's a continued growth of intermittent renewables, and there are more extreme weather events with climate change. This has caused grid instability, driving greater need for power system flexibility and storage. This could be further illustrated by a recent near blackout event in Western Europe, where hydropower and pump storage, also with fossil gas power generation, help to prevent a large-scale blackout. With the phase-out of fossil fuels, future power system will gradually lose a lot of its flexible power plants, and the importance of renewable, flexible service provider in the power system will continue to increase. So despite the clear need for clean and renewable flexibility of storage, pump storage hydropower is under pressure. As you can see in the graph here, most of the recent development are mainly driven in China and led by either government or public utilities. The lack of long-term revenue certainty under existing market designs and the long lead time for pump storage has hindered investment for new projects. Across the world, there are some common barriers and challenges facing pump storage. For example, the lack of awareness for the need of long-duration storage, some unfair policy and market participation rules for pump storage, lengthy permitting processes, and outdated market design that do not appropriately remunerate grid stability service. So these are some common issues and challenges that we all face, no matter which country and jurisdiction you are. To tackle these common challenges, the International Forum on Pump Storage Hydropower was established. The forum is a government-led multi-stakeholder initiative that brings together 13 governments, 7 international development banks, and also the International Renewable Energy Agency, with over 80 organizations across the world to promote and enhance understanding of pump storage in future power system. The IHA Hydropower Association will serve as the secretariat of the forum. We are also extremely pleased to share that recently Colombia and Sri Lanka, and also the European Investment Bank and the Islamic Development Bank have also joined the steering committee of the forum, which we'll hear from Sri Lanka later on in this workshop. So the former Prime Minister of Australia, the Honourable Malcolm Turnbull, has also taken on the role of co-chair for the forum, alongside the acting secretary of US Department of Energy, Kelly Speaks-Beckman. The forum has so far held 2 high-level meetings, and the second meeting was held recently on the 25th of May, with the US Secretary Jennifer Granholm saying that investing in pump storage hydropower is an central part of the President Biden's energy transition plan. So recording of the meeting is available on our forum website. To tackle the common challenges of pump storage, some working groups were established. For example, the Policy and Market Framework Working Group led by GE Renewable Energy. We are developing a global position paper and for policy recommendation that will be applicable across countries and market design. In the Sustainability Working Group led by EDF, we are developing guidelines for sustainable pump storage development with the support and participation from NGOs and research institutes. In the Capabilities, Cost and Innovation Working Group led by WOIF, we are comparing the cost and capabilities of different sorts of system flexibility, highlighting the latest innovation in pump storage and also sharing information on potential resources. So with this is a nice segue to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Matthew Stock from the Australian National University. Dr. Stock and his team has developed the Global Atlas for Potential Pump Storage Sites as a publicly available online tool. And you may also now find the link to the tool in the chat that I will post now. So welcome, Mr. Stock.
Okay, thanks very much. So what I'll be talking to you today is the work that we've done developing a global atlas of off-river pumped hydro storage. Next slide, please. So this gives you a sense of the challenge that we'll be facing moving forward. So this is 1 week's supply and demand in the state of South Australia. So what we're seeing in South Australia is at this point, roughly 50% of the total energy generation is now coming from intermittent sources, that is wind and solar. And so what we're seeing is a range of challenges that this brings forward. We see very, very high ramp rates, times when the residual load is relatively low, challenges in terms of having adequate supply, and challenges around very rapid cycling of individual generators to try and balance supply and demand. Next slide, please. So there's a number of things that we try and adopt when it comes to stabilising variable renewable generation. So the first step is to have technical diversity, that we don't just have a single generation. We've got a mixture of PV and wind and any of the existing renewable generations that we have, such as hydro and biomass. Ideally, it's good to spread generation widely. The larger area that we can spread that generation over, then we get this real advantage of smoothing out the weather. That the wind is blowing in one location, then it may not be blowing somewhere else, and vice versa. Similarly, when the sun's shining in one location, it may be cloudy in another, and we help balance out that variability. The next step we try and take is demand management, that we try and shift loads from times when there's an excess of energy, when there's a shortage of energy in the system to times when there's an excess. So trying to shift things like hot water loads into the middle of the day. But ultimately, once we get to these very high fractions of 50% and greater, then storage starts to become sensible. And ideally, we don't want to store because it's fundamentally inefficient, but eventually it becomes sensible as we get more and more wind and solar in the system. And as was presented by a previous speaker, by far the largest capacity of storage around the world is pumped hydro storage. And that's because of the economics, that it's a relatively cheap way of storing bulk energy. Next slide, please. So this is also just here to try and give you a sense of the relative scale of the different storage technologies. So South Australia hosts the world's biggest battery, at least it was last year, 100 odd megawatts and roughly an hour's storage. And what you see in that purple rectangle there is a sense of the scale of that storage and the power that relative to a week's generation in South Australia. Next slide, please. What we see here, in comparison, is the energy storage and the power for Snowy 2.0. So this is the large pumped hydro scheme that's currently under construction in Australia. And so you can get a real sense of the relative size in terms of both the power and the amount of energy that that's capable of storing, and how that can play a real significant role in trying to support the variability of wind and solar generation. Next slide, please. So as highlighted by our previous speaker, one of the really nice things about pumped hydro is that it's an established technology. There's nothing new to invent. We don't need to think about where costs are going to go in the future. The technology is ready and available today. Reiterating, if we look at the scale of it, we're talking much larger scale of storage, largely because it's relatively easy to store water. And it's that water stored at height, which is storing the energy that we require to be shifted in time. The real challenge, however, has been that it's hard to identify pumped hydro sites, that they depend very, very strongly on the local topography. You need to have a good location high up to be able to have a reservoir and another reservoir close by that's able to store the energy when it's store the water when it's been passed through the generator. And associated with it then is the concerns around large-scale hydro development, the challenges of intercepting rivers and interrupting natural river flows, that ideally people are trying to focus on shifting to generation technologies which have less environmental impact. Can we go to the next slide, please? So the technology that we've been focusing on in terms of the global atlas is to look at these closed loop off-river pumped hydro sites. And the idea with these sites is that they are aiming to be off-river. So you see this particular example is a scheme in Italy, Presenzano. And what we see to the right of that slide is the upper reservoir is situated in a valley high up in the hills. There's a tunnel through the hill and then a penstock running down the face of the hill down to a lower reservoir, which is sitting down in the valley floor. And the advantage of these schemes is that we can now have much higher head than we can for typical on-river schemes, that we can achieve heads in the order of 400, 500, 600 metres. In this particular example, it's around about 500 metres. And we only need relatively small areas to be able to store quite significant amounts of energy. So this particular scheme can store 1 gigawatt of power for a continual operation of 6 hours. And this only requires a reservoir area of around about 100 hectares or about 1 square kilometre. So the advantage of these very high heads is that we can use much smaller water volumes to store the energy that's required. Next slide, please. So our global hydro atlas was built around identifying these potential sites around the world. So the way that we did this was to simulate virtual reservoirs in the landscape. We developed where would the water flow in a landscape to identify where individual minor valleys and gullies are located. And then along those areas, we built these virtual dams. And each location we build this virtual dam 5 metres, taking steps up to 100 metres height, to determine how much water would be stored in a particular location if we would build a reservoir in that place. We then go through the landscape pairing all of those reservoirs whenever we see a separation of more than 100 metres head, up to 800 metres height difference between the two reservoirs. And then we adjust the height of the virtual dam walls so that the amount of energy that's stored and the amount of water that is stored is equal in the two reservoirs. We then go through a ranking process that we do a costing of what those individual sites are based on what the cost of the the tunnel is connecting those two reservoirs, the cost of building the reservoirs, the cost of the powerhouse, the pumps, the turbines, the generators associated with the scheme. And then we determine a ranking going from A being the highest, so being the best sites, having the lowest cost, through to rank E sites, which are about double the cost of the Class A, and anything that's outside of that we reject from the system. And then we record all of that key information along with the shape of the individual reservoirs. Next slide, please. So what we found there was that we then had more than 600,000 individual sites, pumped hydro sites were identified around the world, which had a combined potential energy storage of more than 23,000 terawatt hours of storage. And these are distributed widely across the various regions of the world. And the horizontal red line we see on there is what is the energy storage required to balance 100% renewable energy in Australia, the modelling that we did there. We need roughly 20 gigawatt hours of storage per million people. And you can see right across the globe that all of the regions around the world have more than enough pumped hydro storage to be able to balance out their variable wind and solar generation. Next slide, please. And so all of that information is available in a public atlas. So this is the first page that you would go to if you went into the atlas. You can see that's the links at the bottom. One is to our homepage. The second is a direct link through to the global atlas data. And what you see, unsurprisingly, is that you see pumped hydro sites wherever there is significant elevation differences in an area. So along mountain ranges and hills in the various countries. The next slide, please. So zooming into a particular location, what we see here is zooming in on Thailand. And what we see with the various different coloured dots on there is the different class of sites. So a red dot refers to a Class A site, so the lowest cost sites, through the lighter reds, oranges, through to yellow, representing the various costing stages. What you also see on the left-hand side is that we've done the modelling for a variety of size schemes, from very small schemes around about 2 gigawatt hours, right up to these schemes that we're seeing in this example, which are 150 gigawatt hours of storage. Next slide, please. Then as you zoom in further, as you're using the software and get closer and closer, what you start to see is individual reservoirs start to resolve. What you're seeing here is the light blue represents an upper reservoir and the dark blue represents a lower reservoir. Next slide, please. And then if you go in further, you can see a full 3D representation of individual sites. So again, here we're seeing the upper and lower reservoir of a scheme in Thailand. And if you click on that particular scheme, a pop-up appears, which gives you all of the information about that particular pumped hydro scheme in terms of the location, the size of the reservoir, the storage, etc. All of that information is available for anyone to go in and have a look at. Next slide, please. So in summary, what we're seeing around the world is that variable renewables are growing rapidly. And what we're seeing associated with that is that there are significant challenges for the electricity system to manage that variability of solar and wind. What we find, though, is that pumped hydro is extremely well placed to support that transition as a source of very cheap energy storage. Batteries are great in terms of delivering power. They're very cheap in terms of the electronics for delivering power, but in terms of the energy component and storing energy for longer durations, then pumped hydro is by far the lowest cost technology. And what I presented to you was a global off-river pumped hydro atlas that's freely available. Anyone around the world can go in and have a look and zoom into the particular areas that they're interested in and see a full visualization from either global scale, country scale, right down to individual reservoirs. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Stock. With that, we'd like now to invite Dr. Yuto Xie from the China Renewable Energy Engineering Institute. As you may know, China has the world's largest operating pump storage capacity and also the largest pipeline, and there's from China. So we'd like to welcome Dr. Xie. Thank you.
Thank you, Samuel. Good evening from Beijing. First, I'd like to express my sincere gratitude to ADB and the IHA for giving me this opportunity to share the latest development and the outlook of pump storage hydropower in China. I'm Jie Taoxie from China Renewable Energy Engineering Institute, which is one of the leading think tanks in the field of hydro, solar, wind, and other renewables in China. Next slide, please. As introduced by Samuel, pump storage hydropower is an important form of large-scale energy storage. Using its storage and regulation function, PSH can smooth the fluctuation in the output of solar and wind power generation, facilitate the grid integration of variable renewable energy by enhancing the flexibility and reliability of the grid, which is of great value in the context of clean and low carbon energy transition in the world. Next slide, please. Now I would like to present the latest progress in China. By the end of 2020, China's conventional hydropower installed capacity was 387 gigawatts, including 48 gigawatts under construction, and the pump storage installed capacity was 85.2 gigawatts, in which 31.5 gigawatts was completed and 53.7 gigawatts was under construction. The completed installed capacity of PSH accounts for about 1.4% of the total installed capacity of power generation in China. In addition, there are 130 gigawatts of PSH already planned for future development. Next slide, please. Until now, China has the largest scale of PSH in terms of planned, under construction, and completed installed capacity. With the rapid development of the scale, the design and construction, manufacturing, and R&D level of PSH projects have also been continuously improved. For example, the engineering design of electrometrical and metal structure has reached the top level in the world. Fengning Pump Storage Power Station is one of the flagship PSH projects in China. It is about 180 kilometers away from Beijing, with the world's largest installed capacity of 3,600 megawatts. The project investment is about 2.9 billion US dollars. This project can increase the grid integration capacity of solar and wind power of about 10 gigawatts. It can also provide a large amount of clean energy, reduce carbon dioxide emissions, and have significant environmental benefits. This project also plays a key role in supporting the Green Winter Olympics next year. Next slide, please. The development history of PSH in China shows that at the beginning, most of the PSH plants were located in the southeast coastal areas with the most developed economy, and the north part of China primarily dependent on coal-fired power generation. Here I listed 4 projects completed before 2000. As the development continued, the construction of PSH extended to central and western areas, as well as relatively underdeveloped areas. Since 2005, the development of PSH in China has maintained a very high growth rate. Next slide, please. To improve the resources investigation, planning of site selection, engineering, and operation management of PSH, the Chinese government have issued quite a few policies and regulative frameworks on the construction, tariff, operation of PSH projects. Taking planning, for example, in 2004, it was required that the development of PSH shall be in accordance with the regional integrated plans. In 2016, it is further strengthened that the review and approval of PSH plans must follow the guidance of planning. Next slide, please. There are also some experiences from the development of PSH in China. First one is plan and layout. Based on China's own conditions, we have comprehensively analyzed the necessity of the development of PSH plans. make scientific plan and coordinate the geographical distribution of the plants. This is key to the coordinated and sustainable development. Second is the technology innovation. The development of engineering, manufacture, construction, and installation of high-height, large-capacity units along with the digital management have accelerated the development of PSH in China. Third one is the investment incentive. The government encouraged the diversified investment and stimulated different stakeholders to invest in PSH to keep the industry going forward. Next slide, please. Now, I'd like to share some views on the future development of PSH in China. This slide is about the layout. To explore the future layout of PSH, we shall figure out where PSH needed most. Here I listed some characteristics of the potential locations. For example, areas that are dependent on coal-fired power generation, areas with poor capacity of hydropower regulating and storage, and areas with abundant solar and wind energy power generation. There are two important areas. One is the northwest of China, where solar and wind energy is quite abundant and is in urgent need of support by PSH at the power generation side. The other one is the southeastern coastal areas with the most developed economy and the highest power demand in China. Next slide, please. Recently, the acceleration of energy transition provides PSH a very promising future in China. Last year, Chinese President Xi Jinping announced that China will strive to peak carbon dioxide emissions before 2030 and achieve carbon neutrality before 2060, increase the share of non-fossil fuels in primary energy consumption to about 24% and increase China's total installed capacity of wind and solar power to over 1,200 gigawatts in 2030. This year, the government stated that China will build a new power system with new energy, the primary power source. All of these are of great importance to the PSH development in China. Next slide, please. The randomness and the volatility of variable renewables determine that the larger the scale of solar and wind power, the greater the need for grid flexibility. Currently, PSH is the most mature, safe, and reliable approach for grid regulation for large-scale application. It can increase the integration capacity of grid for wind and solar power and ensure the safe and stable operation of the power system. PSH is also an indispensable component of the source grid load storage integration and multi-energy complementary development, which are innovative development mode encouraged by the government. In this regard, PSH is of great importance for China to achieve carbon peak and carbon neutrality. Next slide, please. Besides the promising future, the development of PSH in China also has some challenges and restrictions. First is the tariff mechanism. At present, the benefits and functions of PSH are not fully reflected in tariffs. The investment and the operating costs are not transferred to the user end and are mainly borne by the power grid companies. This discourages other investors. Another one is the restriction from land planning and environmental protection. In some cases, the plans were restricted by environmental factors and ecological red lines constraints. Therefore, future development of PSH shall pay more attention to the coordination of resources, land planning, and the environmental protection. Next slide, please. Just last month, to accelerate the development of PSH in China, the National Development and Reform Commission of China has issued the opinions on further improving the tariff formation mechanism of pumped storage, which is regarded as a new landmark for PSH development in China. According to this document, two-part tariff policy will remain the primary principle, with energy tariff formed in a market-based competitive approach and competitive tariff incorporated into the grid tariff for transmission and distribution. This reform of tariff mechanism provides a new landscape for the PSH projects and markets in China. Next slide, please. This year, the National Energy Administration of China will initiate a new round of national planning for PSH plants, aiming to satisfy the demand of power system in 2035. Looking forward, I would like to share with you three trends of PSH development in China. First, the PSH in China will continue to grow in scale. It is estimated that the installed capacity of completed PSH in China will probably exceed 60 gigawatts by 2025 and 120 gigawatts by 2030. Secondly, PSH in China will continue to advance in technology. The planning, engineering, and manufacturing levels will be further improved. Thirdly, PSH in China will continue to thrive in investment. With the improvement of the market mechanism, there will be more and diversified investors in the future. Next slide, please. This is the end of my presentation. Thank you very much for your attention. Now I give it back to you, Samuel.
Thank you, Dr. Let's like to invite Mr. Paul Moeller from Hydro Tasmania to share the experience in developing the Battery of the Nation project.
Thank you, Samuel. Good evening, everyone. Next slide, please. Next slide, Samuel. While we're waiting for that to come up, I'm going to start by giving you a little bit of context of the Australian market and show you where Tasmania and Hydro Tasmania fits in and how the opportunity for pumped storage arises in our case. So this is a brief snapshot of the Australian electricity market. The national market is made up of coverage of all the eastern states of Australia. Tasmania is the little island down at the bottom there. It's currently connected to the national market by a 500 megawatt HVDC cable, and that's a significant consideration in how we can operate the system. Tasmania itself is largely hydropower at the moment. In fact, Tasmania reached 100% renewable generation last year, and our government has a target to reach 200% renewable capacity by 2040, with half of that delivered by 2030. So the challenge for us really is in greater interconnection to the mainland states to leverage that renewable capacity. At the moment, there's plans underway for a much greater interconnection between Tasmania and mainland Australia. A project known as Marinus Link is being planned, which would introduce a further 1,500 megawatts of HVDC interconnection, so a total of 2,000 megawatts. The current installed hydro capacity in Tasmania is about 2,300 megawatts, so it's very significant in the context of our current system. Australia as a whole has two existing large-scale hydro power systems. One is the system in Tasmania. There's another scheme, the Snowy Hydro Scheme in New South Wales. And there are three existing pumped hydro schemes in the country. We have none in Tasmania at the moment. There's two located in New South Wales and one in Queensland. So next slide, please. So the Australian market and what is happening with it. Australia has traditionally been largely coal-based generation. That's portrayed by the black and the brown lines along the bottom of that graph. At the moment, Australia's electricity generation is just under 70% from coal generation, but that's rapidly changing. So what you can see here is out to about 2040, a rapid decline in the coal generation. That's as the current coal fleet reaches retirement. Some has already retired in recent years, and that's expected to continue in the coming decades. So what's also happening is a rapid growth of wind and solar. So that's the green and the yellow bars at the top of that graph. You can see a very substantial growth in wind and solar. These projections have been taken from our Australian electricity market operators' projections from a system plan that they update every 2 years. This is from their last year's update. And even since that was done, the growth in wind and solar has far exceeded the projections, so that the growth is occurring much quicker than had been anticipated. The interesting part about this projection for today is the light blue band just underneath the red line. That's the projected growth in large-scale dispatchable storage that's expected to be needed to support that level of renewable solar and wind generation. So that's, in our case, about 15 gigawatts of dispatchable storage is projected to be needed. And that provides a substantial opportunity for pumped hydro storage and also for using existing hydropower in a different way, which I'll touch on shortly. So next slide, please. Just a little bit about Hydro Tasmania itself. The company's been around for over 100 years as a hydropower generator. We've got over 30 power stations and 54 large dams. We're also a joint owner in two of the largest wind farms in Tasmania. We have a consulting business called Insura, which operates internationally. Its main office is in Hobart, but it has other offices around Australia and in India. Insura have provided all the engineering and technical expertise that we've been using on our pumped hydro project, which I'll touch on. So that may be of interest to anyone out there. We also have a retail business located on mainland Australia called Momentum. Next slide, please. So the key to our pumped hydro and other developments in using our existing power scheme depends on more interconnection. The project known as Marinus Link I mentioned is being planned to be delivered in 2 stages of 750 megawatts each, slightly different timings for the delivery of those. And the response we're planning is based on the capacity of the interconnection and the timing of its arrival. So the first cable triggers a response for us in better utilising our existing hydropower system. Something that's often not considered with conventional hydropower is its potential to be used as basically a pseudo pumped hydro storage system. In our case in Tasmania, with more interconnection, we can repurpose the existing hydropower system basically through importing energy into the state at times of surplus generation on mainland Australia, and through that saving and storing energy in our existing hydropower system for dispatch at times of peak demand on the mainland of Australia. So in that regard, it repurposes the existing system and acts as a pseudo pumped hydro storage. To maximise the value from that, we're looking to substantially expand the capacity of the existing hydro system through upgrades and redevelopment of certain older power schemes to up to double their capacity in some cases. We can also utilise what coincidentally becomes spare capacity in our existing system, which is a coincidence of the seasonal peak demands in Australia. The peak demand period in Victoria, which is the connection point for us into mainland Australia, occurs over summer, which happens to be the lowest demand time in Tasmania. Tasmania being further south has a much colder climate. So we can utilise that spare capacity that occurs over the summer months. The second cable will trigger a pumped hydro development, and we're currently planning a 750 megawatt development, and that would be timed to coincide with the introduction of the second Marinus Link cable. So next slide, please. So in Tasmania, the nature of the state and its existing hydropower offers huge potential for development with pumped hydro storage schemes. We initially did a scan of the state similar to what Matt Stocks described in the pumped hydro atlas, and quickly identified over 2,000 potential sites around the state. We quickly narrowed that down through some multi-criteria selections, quickly focusing in on the sites that maximise the utilisation of existing hydro infrastructure. For example, existing reservoirs for either an upper or lower reservoir, or in some cases both the upper and lower reservoir. And we conducted further detailed pre-feasibility studies across 14 of those sites, which resulted in the selection of 3 sites you can see here, which we've been conducting full feasibility studies on. We've since selected the first one, called Lake Sathana, as the preferred site that we will go on to develop in line with the Marinus Link interconnector. It's a 750 megawatt project with about 20 hours of storage duration. So what we've found in the selection of these sites and the detailed studies is there's some key physical parameters that are vital for the success and the viability of these pumped hydro projects. In our case, there's obviously a benefit in using existing infrastructure. So the lower storage in these cases would use an existing hydro lake. But the other key aspects are short connection distances and high heads. So Matt also touched on high heads. One of our criteria for selection of sites set a minimum head of 300 metres, but I think from our experience that was probably too low, and we'd look to 500 to 600 metres of head to maximise the energy storage without the need for very large upper storages. The other key aspect in short connection distances is that these projects tend to be underground developments with underground tunnel connections, and that's a very costly part of developing a pumped hydro project. So the shorter the connection distances, the more cost effective they will be. So I think that brings me to the end of the presentation. I'll be available afterwards for questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. So with that, we'd like to invite Dr. Kamal Laksiri, Project Director of Sealand Electricity Board, to share their vision on pump storage development in Sri Lanka. Dr. Laksiri, please.
Yeah, thank you. Good afternoon and good evening to all of you, depending on the location you are now. Thank you for giving me this opportunity to make a presentation in this forum, and also for the kind introduction. Now let me start this short presentation on pump storage power development in Sri Lanka. Next slide, please. Yeah, in this presentation, I will give you some general information on Sri Lanka, some statistics on the relevant to the power and energy sector, and then about the pump storage background and the current status. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Yeah, Sri Lanka is an island in the Indian Ocean. I think most of you know, situated just below the giant India. We are separated by a seabed of about 35 kilometers wide. It has a surface area of 65,000 square kilometers and population of almost 22 million as per the latest census conducted. GDP per capita is about 3,850 US dollars at 2019, that is pre-COVID levels. So these are some basic details about our country, Sri Lanka. Next slide, please. Then some basic facts about the power and energy sector administration setup. Next slide, please. The policy maker for the power sector is Ministry of Power, representing the government. Then we have the regulator, Public Utilities Commission of Sri Lanka. CEB as the main operator acts under transmission, generation and distribution licenses issued by the regulator PUCSL. CEB is the sole licensee for transmission and also possesses one generation license and 4 distribution licenses. Then we have Lanka Electricity Company, LECO, a subsidiary company of CEB, is also issued with 1 distribution license and serves some parts of the country. So that is about the power and sector energy administration in the country. Next slide, please. Then if I mention some facts about the energy supply and usage in the country, as you can see there, main supply sources are petroleum, biomass, coal and hydro. The graph shows how the supply has increased during the last 25 to 30 years. In your right-hand side, when you look at the energy use, the main energy use is household and commercial sector with a share of about 40%. And then second is the transport sector with a share of 36%. And lastly, the industry sector with a 24% share. Next slide, please. System capacities, if I mention here, the present total installed capacity is reaching 5,000 megawatt. We are a small system. We are reaching this limit with the recent additions. What you see is the breakdown of the installed capacity as at the end of the year 2020. There recently we added the new 100 megawatt wind power plant. With that, our wind capacity increases to 280 megawatts. So as you can see, there still the main contributor is hydro, and it will further increase with the new plants to be added to the system in the near future. Sri Lanka has already reached 100% electrification level, while CEB, the main operator, serving about 7 million customers in the country. Then you can see some other parameters like the peak demand, that is in 2020 reached 2,717 megawatts, and our system loss is about 9%. Next slide, please. Then if we look at the last 5 years, our electricity demand has been growing at an annual rate of 5.5%. Similarly, the peak demand also grows at 4% annual growth. In the same way, it is forecasted that the demand will grow at an annual rate of 5 to 6% in the coming 20 years. So all our future expansion programs are planned to meet this growth in the demand. Next slide, please. Then I can mention about the clean energy policy of the country. According to the latest policy of the government, we are to serve 70% of the electricity demand from clean energy sources by the year 2030, and also intended to reach the carbon neutral status by the year 2050. To achieve these targets, there will have to be large additions of renewable energy sources in addition to the other measures planned. Next slide, please. Now let me mention about the pump storage initiation in Sri Lanka. This is something new to us. The need for pump storage power plants to the Sri Lanka system was first identified in a study conducted in 2014 under the technical assistance of JICA, that is the Japanese lending agency. So in this study, titled Development Planning on Optimal Power Generation for Peak Power Demand in Sri Lanka, pump storage option was recognized as a viable solution after considering the several available options. Next slide, please. So these pump storage plants are expected to act as large-scale energy storage devices while adding the required mechanical inertia to the system to improve the system stability. In addition to that, pump storage plants are expected to balance out the intermittent generation of large renewable energy sources to be added to the system, that is wind and solar, in the near future. Next slide, please. After long years of studies on pump storage, after long years of studies, pump storage has been included in the least cost long-term generation expansion plan of Sri Lanka since the year 2015. These plans are updated every 2 years and prepared for a period of 20 years ahead. The requirement of pump storage is critically important in absorbing the large portion of renewable energy sources to be added. As per the future long-term renewable energy development goals, there will be additions up to 1,300 megawatts of wind and 2,200 megawatts of solar to the power system, and presence of pump storage in the system is mandatory to get the optimum use of these renewable sources. Next slide, please. So according to the latest least cost long-term generation expansion plan of Sri Lanka, that is the plan prepared for the period 2020 to 2039, we need to add 3 numbers of 200 megawatt pump storage power plants to the system starting from the year 2028. So this is the finding of the recommendation of the long-term generation expansion plan. Next slide, please. So currently, in the continuation of the initial studies conducted, we have identified 11 candidate sites for pump storage development in the country. So then subsequently in the review studies conducted, 2 potential sites from 11 sites were selected. And now it is planned to proceed with further studies to find out the best site for development. Next slide, please. So as at present, this is the intended implementation plan. Of these 2 sites selected, one has already passed the pre-feasibility level, while the other having done only a preliminary study. So under the next phase of studies to be conducted soon, we plan to supplement the investigation studies as shown to select the best site for development. Next slide, please. With that, as I explained, we are working with the goal of establishing the first pump storage power plant in Sri Lanka by the year 2020, as identified in the long-term generation expansion plans. With that, I conclude my short presentation on pump storage power development in Sri Lanka, and thank you for your kind attention.
Thank you, Dr. Lasiri. Now I'd like to invite Professor Jamie Picktop from the Australian National University, who is also leading the APEC workshop on the use of pump storage hydropower. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's a pleasure and a great opportunity to talk to you today. I'm the project leader for a project supported through the Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation's Energy Working Group. Next slide, please. And in February, we held a workshop with representatives of most of the 21 economies who are members of APEC to discuss the role of pump storage hydropower. One of the key motivations is that APEC members have committed to incorporating measures to achieve an aggregate doubling of renewable generating capacity in APEC by 2030. And that's a really significant commitment in that the 21 APEC economies represent around 60% of the world's energy demand. Next slide, please. APEC recently reviewed its energy demand and supply and noted that energy demand in APEC economies is continuing to increase, expected to increase by a fifth by 2050. They noted that energy demand is being decoupled from economic growth, which is very positive news. And in fact, APEC's energy intensity target looks like being achieved well ahead of schedule. However, unless something major changes, APEC would be unable to achieve its target of doubling the share of renewables in the energy mix between 2010 and 2030. And one of the factors in that is the need to have energy storage capacity, electricity storage capacity, to enable greater generation from solar and wind. Next slide, please. As part of our project for the Energy Working Group, we looked at the existing and planned pump storage hydro developments in the 21 economies, as well as the potential for pump storage to contribute to this work. You can see here, as previous speakers have mentioned, that the People's Republic of China, Japan and the United States thus far have been the countries that have deployed most pump storage hydropower. Next slide, please. And so we can see that there's essentially three groups of economies in relation to pump storage in the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation area, where you've got the three countries who've developed the most capacity, a number of economies who have a modest amount of capacity, and a much larger number of economies who don't have much energy storage capacity as yet. Next slide, please. And so, as Dr. Xi outlined very well, China has the largest amount of pump storage hydropower capacity and a very active program to add more, and is really the global leader. Japan has substantial capacity. In the United States, the greatest proportion of electrical storage capacity, 97%, is from pump storage, but there's been very little development in recent years. And this was quite a topic of discussion in our project amongst the representatives from the economies about why it's not possible to develop more, which I'll come back to. Next slide, please. And so when we examined the economies with some pump storage development, you can see the six economies represented here. Pump storage hydropower is the bulk of the energy storage capacity, and in some economies such as Australia, as Paul just outlined, there is new capacity being added. Next slide, please. A number of economies that have not previously had energy storage are now looking to add pump storage, particularly these four economies listed here. And that's quite significant because a number of these economies have proposed grid interlinkages with neighbours, for example, Vietnam, which would perhaps add regional capacity for storing electricity. Next slide, please. A number of economies at this point don't have don't have active plans. Sorry, next slide, please. don't have active plans for pump storage, but they have a lot of potential to develop that capacity, which we can see from the work of Dr. Stocks and other colleagues at ANU. And so there's quite some potential to support the electricity systems. Next slide, please. And so to summarise our review of energy storage, and in particular pump storage in the 21 economies, there's some significant experience in the Asia-Pacific region with installing pump storage hydro capacity, particularly led by China and Japan. 21 of the 24 economies have significant untapped potential for pump storage development to support a transition to renewable energy. The other 3 economies have transmission links to neighbouring economies that do have a lot of pump storage potential. And this means that some of the electricity grid interconnections that have been considered in the context of regional programs like the Greater Mekong Subregion Program and ASEAN's program have potential to include pump storage to assist in regional shifts to renewable energy. Energy storage is becoming increasingly important. There are many economies in the region that suffer from blackouts at times. As I think Mr. Law outlined at the beginning of the seminar, the different energy storage technologies have different characteristics that are suitable for different purposes. And pump storage is really important for that substantial energy storage over large periods of time. Can we move to the final slide, please? And so in the project, we considered some of the next steps that we will be recommending to the APEC Energy Working Group this month for further consideration. And there were 4 areas where we saw pump storage could be advanced in the region. One is working with select economies who don't currently have that capacity to scope where they might include pump storage. The second is to assess what the role of pump storage could be for interconnections among national electricity grids and in regional systems to move to renewable power. One important issue or opportunity that arose from the workshop was discussion about what's the availability of knowledge and gaps of knowledge on renewable energy potential and electricity market operations that would help inform business and governments to invest in pump storage. And in particular, as I think Dr. Z outlined very well in the case of China, it's really important to reform electricity markets to ensure that developers of energy storage systems can access income from frequency and ancillary services to support the investment in this important capacity. With that, Mr. Law, I will leave it and look forward to our discussion.
Thank you, Dr. Pickard. We'd like to start our question and answer session. So would all speakers turn on your camera and join us with a short discussion for 15 minutes. So I think the first question, a very interesting question from Lawrence, is how do we assess the value of storage and flexibility service provided by pump storage, and what are the initiatives in Asia to develop this storage market? So I wonder if maybe Professor Pickard and Dr. Xie, you could share some insights from your work.
Perhaps I could start. one of the discussions among the APEC economies was that very few of the governments of those economies currently have markets that pay for energy storage capacity separate to the generation, and that it's really important for development of investment in further energy storage that governments reform their electricity markets so that there are income streams for utilities that develop that storage capacity for frequency and ancillary services. We've seen some evolution of that in the Australian market. It probably could go further. And I think if I hand over to Dr. Z, it sounds like that's important in China as well.
Hi, Sonny. I'm sorry, the signal is not very good. Could you repeat the question again?
So the question was about what are the incentives, for example, in China to assess the value of storage and flexibility. For example, in your presentation, you have mentioned the new two-part tariff system in China. So I wonder maybe it would be useful for the audience to learn what are China's doing to value these services.
Okay, thank you for your question. This is a very good question. For China, I think first of all, as I have already introduced, we are very committed to the energy transition and to increase the share of renewables in the energy systems. So the development of pumped storage hydropower is very important for China to achieve the energy transition goals. And for the incentives, first, as I mentioned, we have just issued the two-part tariff, and it's kind of like a framework that clarifies the responsibilities and all the mechanisms of the tariff. So it is before it's maybe not very clear, but right now, after this document, the framework is more clear than before, and it have very the directive and they can lead the market to a new landscape that the two parts. For first of all, the energy tariff, it will be formed in the competitive way when there's a spot market, like spot power market, then the price will go with the spot market. But if there's no spot market in the province, the price will go with in the competitive bid. So it will connect the tariff of the PSH to the spot market, and this is like an improvement, and it's also a very good attempt for future development. And also we have in terms of the scale of the market, the government are right now formulating a new round of plan for those pumped storage hydropower. They, as I mentioned, right now the current size plan for future is 130 gigawatts. But after the new round of the planning, the number will go to a very high number. So this plan is aimed for the target of 2035, which means that we will explore the possibility of any other the PSH sites in the next 15 years. Thank you.
Thank you. Very exciting development in China and really a lot for the other countries to learn. And another, I think, hot topic in pump storage is regarding the environmental and social aspect with sustainability of the project. So we've got our friends from Rivers Without Borders, Without Boundaries from Russia, Mr. Eugene Simonov. And a question for Mr. Paul Moeller. So, for example, in the Tasmanian planning, do you have conduct strategic environmental assessment, and how are you managing the environmental and social impacts for the project going forward? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the question. That's a really important question. In our case, really the environmental and social impact management begins right at the outset, from site selection, right at the beginning. Key criteria in the selection of sites for us includes environmental and social impact considerations. So we look to minimise the potential impacts from the outset through our site selection. For example, utilising existing hydro infrastructure, so minimising the need for new infrastructure is an important consideration, and also avoiding the obvious environmental issues like endangered species or threatened species. In Tasmania, we also have a number of areas that are reserved for World Heritage Area reserves and other national environmentally significant areas, so we avoid those altogether. We've never even considered sites that would encroach on a World Heritage Area. So that begins the early selection. That minimises the likely impacts later on as the project gets into a more detailed stage. Then we look at minimising consideration of things like construction impacts, spoil disposal, for example, new road and access infrastructure, and importantly, visual impact. So this is a key consideration, particularly in any sites near local communities. We use photographic, artificially created images of what projects will look like. So we can engage with communities on the visual impact and other aspects of construction. We go through an extensive local community engagement process that lasts for years, literally. So we take communities and key stakeholders on the journey with us on our plans and proposals, and importantly, take into consideration any local community concerns. So that's important from a social impact consideration. I think, however, our experience in all of this so far is that the pumped hydro storage schemes themselves are not the area of the greatest concern in this regard, particularly social impact-wise. It's the transmission connections. And that's what's arising in Australia, where the greatest concerns are that need a whole of industry consideration. So it's not necessarily just the pumped hydro storage itself, but grid connections that need to be considered in this regard.
Mr. Law, I wonder if I might add to Paul's response to Mr. Simonov. Pumped hydro, like any large development, if it's done badly, could have some very negative impacts on people and the environment. What I think is exciting about pumped hydro, though, are the many opportunities to develop the electricity system with low or positive benefits for the environment. I think, as Dr. Stocks outlined, there's a very large range of choice for pumped storage hydropower because these sites can be constructed off river and often on brownfield sites or other degraded lands. And as an example, a pumped storage project has recently commenced development in North Queensland that, for example, uses an abandoned mine pits. Many of the pump storage projects provide an opportunity to re-engineer and reuse old dams that were built in error before there was good understanding about how to minimise the impacts on the environment. And so there is the potential in building pump storage to actually lower the environmental impacts of the existing dams through such things as installing multi-level offtake towers or bigger valves to enable appropriate environmental flows. And in this way, there are opportunities, I think, to actually positively benefit the environment.
Thank you. Very insightful feedback. And also from the International Hydropower Association, I think we would strongly recommend the use of hydropower sustainability tools whenever in all parts of the development cycle of pump storage hydropower. The tools are developed by a multi-stakeholder council of NGOs, governments, research institutes. So it's a very comprehensive tool that you may get your hydropower pump storage project to be accessible for green finance under the CBI newly approved hydropower green finance criteria, and also eligible for the EU taxonomy for sustainable financing. So it's something that at IHA we encourage all developers to adopt the sustainability tools, which will also be turned into a global standard for sustainable hydropower next year. So with that discussion on off-river hydro, and there's also another interesting question around the use of seawater pump storage across the world. So with water availability, another question facing pump storage, do the panelists, for example, I think Dr. Stock or Dr. Xie, would you have insights on the use of seawater?
So seawater is a complicated challenge. So there's only been one pumped hydro scheme built around seawater. That was in Japan, and that particular system has actually been decommissioned since then. So while it has the advantage of not requiring a lower reservoir, you can use the ocean as the reservoir. It does have both potentially environmental impacts if you don't manage how the salt water interacts with the land. And there's significant challenges managing both the corrosion challenge and the marine growth challenge associated with using seawater as the working fluid. So there was a major scheme being investigated here in Australia. So there was in Kaltana. There's quite a bit of documentation available if people want to go looking. And ultimately, the decision was that it made more sense to go for a freshwater scheme in the same location rather than to go for a saltwater scheme. The other important thing to recognise here is that pumped hydro is quite different to conventional hydropower in the amount of water that's being consumed. And because the water is being continuously cycled in a closed loop, once you've achieved the initial fill, really all you're doing is replating evaporation and leakage. So in most locations, rainfall actually exceeds the evaporation, and therefore you're going to find that you don't really need have an ongoing water need. And the analysis we did for Australia was that we would actually use less water in total for a system dominated by wind, solar and pumped hydro in comparison to our existing schemes where we're dominated by thermal generation and all of the water that's associated with the cooling for coal plants. So I think the water issue for pumped hydro is possibly a little bit overstated as a concern. And salt water would be a significant challenge to deliver equivalent outcomes to what you could achieve with fresh water.
And can you hear me? And
yes.
From my perspective, we in China we have just as I mentioned in my slides, there are two important areas with the highest demand for pump storage hydropower. One is in the coastal areas. So this question is very important that for China, if this seawater pump storage will be mature, it will be very good complementary for our for the landscape of pump storage hydropower. Actually, the government have already done some pre-studies and also the planning and also the resources investigation of the seawater pump storage. But for now, as mentioned by Mr. Peter, there are still pending issues of the technical barriers for us to move on. But I think in the future, this is a potential direction for China that we will explore the possibility of building the seawater pump storage. I'm not sure, but I think there are some sites already undergoing and maybe in the pre-feasibility studies phase. But I think there will be some new sites with seawater pump storage in China in the upcoming year.
Thank you all. Finally, a last question for Dr. Siri. So as you are planning to develop your first pump storage hydropower, what is the most significant challenge that you think you will encounter? And how do you think international cooperation could help address this challenge?
Yeah, thank you for the question. Actually, as mentioned, we are new to hydropower and pump storage, and we are about to start the first plant in the country. So as I see, the main challenges are the environmental and also the financial. Environmentally, now most of the sites identified, and of course the last two sites we selected are in forest reserves. So it's a challenge, I think, as Paul mentioned. So we need to do a comprehensive environmental impact assessment. So that is a challenge in the forest reserves. And then next challenge is the investing or the financing the projects of this scale. So these are for economies like ours, we cannot finance on our own. So we need to get the assistance of the lending agencies or to look for new financing models with private sector participation. So as I see, those are the main challenges we face. Thank you.
Thank you all for your very insightful discussion today at this workshop. So now I'd like to quickly wrap up and thank you all again. You may turn off your camera and we will start to wrap up summary. So pump storage hydropower, as stated with all our speakers on the panel, could provide an important tool in reaching our decarbonization goal across governments. However, we will need more political will to support this development, and especially in terms of developing policy mechanisms to support the finance pump storage hydro. And also, in this journey, international cooperation and sharing of knowledge will be very important. So with this, we would like to provide some emerging findings from the forum's 3 working group. For example, in the policy and market frameworks working group, we are looking at different opportunities to pump storage hydropower, including policy mechanisms such as mandate, financing support, which is what Dr. Lasiri said, very crucial, and also remuneration scheme in market design, for example, capacity market and series service development. We are also providing global recommendations in planning and modeling, for example, to support the mapping of potential sites for streamlining licensing, to design the electricity market with long-term revenue certainty, and also perhaps we will support pump storage in COVID recovery schemes. Apart from the global recommendations, we also developed 11 regional and national papers for more specific country recommendations. We have developed papers for Australia led by Hydro Tasmania, in China, in India, and also in Southeast Asia. We also provide recommendations for other parts of the world. In the Sustainability Working Group, we are providing emerging recommendations for guidelines on building sustainable pump storage. For example, new projects need to be assessed from a multi-level perspective, from system needs to options assessment to project optimization. And we will recommend the use of hydropower sustainability tools, which is now eligible for green financing. And the issue of carbon footprinting has also been dealt with cautious attention to avoid misleading conclusions. And from our experience and findings, greenhouse gas emission from hydropower pump storage reservoirs do not seem to be a significant concern over the long term. We also try to assess the local benefits for recovery. As you know, pump storage hydropower has a large civic infrastructure component. Over 70% of the capex is in civic infrastructure. So the money spent could be flowing directly to local economies. And this also reduces reliance for importing raw materials, as you may see in chemical battery storage. So finally, for the capabilities, cost, and innovation working group, apart from the cost capabilities comparison table that you have just seen, we are also promoting new innovations in pump storage. For example, also on the topic of seawater, as you may see, Chile right now, Oceanus and EDF, they are partnering to develop a new type of pump storage coupled with desalination so that it could actually generate fresh water 24/7. And we are also looking at new innovative solutions such as thermal underground pump storage, which is combining pump storage with thermal storage for 95% efficiency, and also retrofitting disused mine into pump storage, as Dr. Stock has just mentioned. There's a project ongoing in Australia. The Genix project is a 250 megawatt project that converts from a gold mine to pump storage. So finally, we'd like to encourage all you join the forum and participate in our working groups. If you are from a government representative or a regulator, then we will very much encourage you to join the forum steering committee, and we will have the next forum steering committee meeting in July. Finally, all the deliverables of the forum will be launched at the World Hydropower Congress on 16th of September. So the World Hydropower Congress this year will be a fully virtual event. It will be a landmark event for the hydropower sector, as we will launch the findings of the International Forum on Pump Storage alongside other key statements such as the sustainability standard for hydropower, and also a San Jose Declaration for sustainable hydropower development. So you may already now register for the World Hydropower Congress for free. And please visit the website as outlined here. So thank you all for participating in this workshop today. I hope you have found this workshop useful. So please feel free to get in touch with us. If you have not addressed your questions, we will get back to you, and we'll also share recordings and slides with all of you after the meeting. Thank you so much.